There is no question that cities are where the most crucial change is needed when it comes to fighting climate change. Just over half of the world's total population already live in cities, and that's set to increase to near 70% by 2050. Jason Byrne from the University of Tasmania warns that time is running out. When you look around the world, specifically Asia-Pacific, Jason, which cities are most vulnerable and what are the timeframes around meaningful action?
I think it's frightening when we look around the world and we look around the Asia-Pacific to see just how short the timeframes are that we have to act. In many ways, we're being complacent as a global society, but in the Asia-Pacific more particularly, thinking that we have generations, decades to act. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that that window for action is indeed very narrow, and we may have less than a decade in which to scale up the sort of responses that we need to be taking before we break through what we might be considering as planetary boundaries for sustaining our life support systems on the planet, but also being visited by some of these kind of global consequences like heat waves and flooding that we're seeing more recently. So some of the cities around the Asia Pacific that are acutely vulnerable are cities like Shanghai, for example, where we may see large parts of Shanghai go underwater by the middle of the century. And this is frightening when we think about that kind of pace and scale of change. Other cities like Jakarta, for example, in Indonesia, acutely vulnerable to flooding and to sea level rise. And then we have cities in Australia and New Zealand that are just as vulnerable as well with things like heat waves and bushfires.
So when you're looking around the world and you're seeing these cities which need drastic action, what are some of the most creative and successful solutions and innovations that you've seen cities implement to tackle climate change?
There are some very creative solutions to tackling climate change and climate change impacts, both in terms of adapting to the changes that are already beginning to manifest, but also in mitigating, in cutting our emissions, because cities account for up to 70% of global emissions. So cities are both the problem and a potential solution to climate change, paradoxically. So we can look at some good examples like Seoul in Korea, for example. They're tackling a big problem with car dependence, which is a high source of emissions, carbon emissions, through private automobile use. They're tackling that by tearing out freeways. And you might go, hang on a second, tearing down freeways? Seriously? But in Seoul, in the Cheonggae-Cheong Expressway, was removed and turned into a large greenway that now runs through the heart of the city. It has brought back numerous species that weren't seen in Seoul in many decades. The temperature in Seoul has declined dramatically and more people are now taking public transportation. So that's one example of a very innovative, albeit quite dramatic intervention to adjust to climate change.
So how would you define then the optimal holistic approach to sustainability for the major urban centres around the region?
One thing we need to be doing in terms of city planning and thinking about the Asia Pacific and adapting to climate change is to think more systematically and how, in fact, we are in these coupled systems between humans and nature. So in the past, we had this kind of siloed approach where we thought we could extract profit through economic models and we didn't worry so much about pollution. Nowadays, we're beginning to realise that we have to think in a joined-up fashion. So a good example might be what we would call urban metabolism, where we consider waste, which in the past was something we didn't think about too much, and reimagine how it might be a bonus for us. Waste to energy is one of those that's talked about a fair bit. But can we imagine, for example, waste to district level heating, where we take sewage, run it through digesters, harvest the methane, and then use that for heating, for cooking, and even for cooling, for energy generation, for cooling. So it's about flipping our paradigm that we've had in the past on its head and thinking about how we might turn a problem into a solution.
What's going to kickstart that kind of change, turning problems into solutions for cities and for countries that are slow to embrace change?
That kind of change is already underway. We've seen global compact of cities, the C40 cities, which in fact is now about 96 cities around the world, which have joined together, not waiting for higher level state governments or federal governments to act, but instead have realised that that citizens are incredibly vulnerable to climate change impacts, that the economic prosperity of cities is also threatened, jobs and livelihoods under threat by climate change. And so the cities are beginning to join together and share some of their innovative solutions. The example I gave earlier about waste to cooking, waste to heating, Bristol has used waste from a sewage treatment plant to power a bus as part of its public transportation system. We can think about ways that we could scale that across cities around the world. So instead of producing emissions, we're reducing emissions.
And really using the circular economy concept.
Yeah, Kalundborg in Denmark is a great example of the circular economy concept, where a whole bunch of industries that used to pollute have been joined together in a kind of metabolism relationship, where the waste output from one industry becomes the raw material input for another industry. So they've taken a power station and connected it to a gyprock plant that makes plasterboard. Some of the waste from the power station are used for cosmetics. The waste heat for the power station is then used for growing food locally, because food is one of those key challenges that we face at the moment. So we can begin to get some metabolic processes in place within cities, treating them like they're organisms.
You've brought about some great examples, during our conversation today, sort of right across the world. Are you hopeful overall about this journey? Are we doing enough? Are we doing it fast enough?
If you had asked me whether I'm hopeful 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said, yes, I'm very optimistic. Now, my hope has been tempered a little bit by the pace and scale of some of the changes that we're seeing around the world. I think some of these problems that we're seeing with global heat waves, for example, flooding, and even coastal erosion, suggests that the impacts of climate change are manifesting a lot stronger than what we thought they would, and earlier. So my hope has been tempered a little bit, but yes, I'm still optimistic actually that we do have solutions that we can scale. The critical thing is having the political will to put those into place.